Hello and welcome to the LLG Grapevine podcast. You're listening to Helen McGrath, Head of Public Affairs, and Dennis Hall, LLG Bulletin Editor.
Hi everyone.
Now Dennis, you've been following the latest announcements from the government concerning what councils ought to do about their Russian contracts. What's the latest?
Well, yes, government has moved very quickly on this. We have a new policy guidance note and fresh advice. Here's my report. The Cabinet Office has issued a procurement policy note on how contracting authorities can further cut ties with companies backed by the states of Russia and Belarus. The PPN cautions contracting authorities about the impact of Section 17 of the Local Government Act 1988 and says that they should note that they are prohibited from taking into account in their procurement decisions non-commercial considerations, including the location of any country or territory of the business activities or interests of contractors, or from terminating contracts for non-commercial reasons. It says that the Department for Levelling Up is considering an amendment through secondary legislation to address that issue. Now, the policy note says that councils should review their contract portfolio and identify any contracts where the prime contractor is a Russian or Belarusian supplier. Next, they should then consider terminating that contract in accordance with its terms. And finally, they should only proceed to terminate a contract if an alternative supplier can be sourced in line with value for money, affordability, and with minimal disruption to public services. Now, as background, the Cabinet Office says that in-scope organisations should take a proportionate and risk-based approach to reviewing their contract portfolio. The focus should be on major contracts and those which could have the most impact and influence on the Russian or Belarusian regimes. The PPN adds that it is important that the terms of the contract and the implications of termination are correctly understood. When taking action to terminate, the process set out in the contract should be followed precisely to ensure the termination is valid. Now, LLG's own guidance, which has already been published, very much corresponds with this latest guidance from government. And of course, we will keep you up to date on this important topic.
Yes, and a big thanks to Kiran Gahi for all his work on the guidance. Announced by the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities, the government will begin naming and shaming failing social housing landlords on social media. This will include published findings by the Housing Ombudsman of severe maladministration and judgments of the regulator of social housing that consumer standards have been breached. Where appropriate, the Secretary of State will contact landlords to understand how they are taking appropriate steps to address the Ombudsman's and regulators' findings. All landlords are expected to self-refer breaches of standards to the regulator of social housing. Where landlords have failed to self-refer and a breach is found, they will be contacted by ministers. In 2020-21, the Ombudsman issued a total of 3,455 orders and recommendations following investigations with awards of compensation totaling 450,000. Since September 21, there have been 9 landlords who have had a finding of severe maladministration by the Ombudsman, 3 of which were local authorities. Now, Dennis, taxis are in the news, and I hear that the government is consulting on proposed changes to best practice. What's the news there?
Yes, taxis are in the news, and the government are planning to issue new best practice guidance, the latest since 2010, and it'll take into account the advances in modern technology that have affected the sector over recent years. Here's my report. The Department of Transport is to consult on a proposed updated version of its taxi and private hire vehicle best practice guidance. The DFT first issued best practice guidance to licensing authorities in 2006, and this was refreshed in 2010, and much has changed since then. The latest consultation will run for 12 weeks until the 20th of June. Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State at the DFT, Baroness Veer, said the adoption of new technology has resulted in a much changed sector since the Department for Transport last refreshed its best practice guidance in 2010. The biggest change is the ease with which passengers are able to engage services using an app or a mobile phone, for example, was something unimaginable in 2010. The increase in services has fueled increases in the number of drivers in the sector, making a fundamental change to the way the industry works and how these services are now delivered. The Minister said that a further challenge was the transition to zero-emission vehicles to mitigate the impact of travel on air quality and climate change. Baroness Veer went on to say that licensing authority policies should reflect the lead and assistance that government is providing in all of these areas. It is important they provide the certainty the sector needs so that it is able to plan ahead and invest. She claimed that the benefits of zero-emission vehicles could be transformative for the taxi and private hire vehicle industry. The Minister said a constant message she heard from stakeholders was the need for consistency in standards across all licensing authorities. And she also recognises, too, the significance of safeguarding issues and the need for a new uniform guidance to ensure greater protections for those who use taxis and private hire vehicles. Baroness Veer said the government's commitment is to introduce new legislation as soon as parliamentary time allows to enable the setting of national minimum licensing standards to cover the whole sector.
Well, the Department of Health and Social Care has published a summary of engagement by the Department of Health and Social Care, NHS England and the Local Government Association following their ICP engagement document, Integrated Care System Implementation. This engagement included stakeholders with an interest in the formation of ICPs and will inform how DHSC, NHS England and the Local Government Association guide and support the development of these new partnership arrangements ahead of their implementation in July 2022 and beyond. Engagement was based on the 5 expectations of integrated care partnerships. These are: ICPs will drive the direction and policies of the integrated care system. ICPs will be rooted in the needs of people, communities, and places. ICPs create a space to develop and oversee population health strategies to improve health outcomes and experiences. ICPs will support integrated approaches and subsidiarity. ICPs should take an open and inclusive approach to strategy development and leadership involving communities and partners, and utilise local data and insights. A broad and diverse range of approaches to ICP governance models are emerging, including forums and small committees amongst the ICS areas who are further along in their ICP development. Some areas intend for the ICB chair to also chair the ICP, subject to the passage of the bill, while some will have a chair drawn from a local authority. Some have opted for a shared or rotating co-chair model. The department, recognising that ICPs will be at different stages of development and varying complexity, have set out an indicative timeline to help all systems identify the key milestones in developing the ICP and the integrated care strategy, with 2022 to 2023 being a transitional year. I would urge all members to read this summary. Now, Dennis, you've been looking at the new white paper on education. Tell us more.
Helen, this new white paper is important. The government is determined to academise all schools and to remove them ultimately out of council control. But why are policy choices always binary in education? Let me explain. You know, education policy has always puzzled and confounded me. In the 1960s, when I was growing up, the massive controversy was between those who favoured grammar schools, an old concept even then, and the new style comprehensive schools much preferred by many educationalists. Today, the new kid on the block is the much feted academy school, and as the government knows, the majority of parents flock to the idea of sending their children to their local, fully resourced academy school. And so, enter the new government white paper last week, all carefully crafted to reflect the modern-day predilections that shape education policy for the future. In-come more academy schools, outgo local authority maintained schools with a deadline of 2030 for all schools to become academy trusts. Central to the white paper is this unbridled political drive for academy trusts to take over the running of schools in England, with a 2030 target date for converting council-maintained schools into academies, and for them to have joined, or at least be preparing to join, a multi-academy trust. Now, the LGA rightly point out in their response that councils have an excellent track record in providing a high-quality education for pupils, with 92% of maintained schools rated by Ofsted as outstanding or good, a higher proportion than any other type of school. But hang on a minute, what then is the government case to justify this policy change in the management of schools? The government message is a simple one. Academy trusts are good, but council-run schools are bad, so let's get rid of them, despite the evidence. Should there be a law created, I wonder, that requires public policy to be evidence-based? Just something to think about, perhaps. Or is my puzzlement on this topic just set to continue?
I think it's likely we'll all be confused for some time to come, Dennis. Last week, the Children and Families Act Committee held their first oral evidence session as part of their post-legislative scrutiny of the Act. The session focused on the improvements which are required in the adoption system. Witnesses highlighted that kinship and birth families remain marginalised by the kinship system, with kinship carers receiving less funding and support than adoptive and foster parents, despite delivering good outcomes for children. Dr. Peake, CEO of Kinship, said that it was a mistake to not include kinship care in the 2014 Act, and all of the witnesses agreed that legislation is needed to support kinship carers as current guidance is too open to interpretation. Meanwhile, Professor Farmer, an academic, said that the Act had not led to much change, particularly in recruiting the range of adopters that are needed, with single adopters still being passed over. The need to strengthen early intervention services to support pregnant mothers before crisis point is reached, and the need for support for adoptive children and parents after adoption to support attachment and better outcomes was also raised. LLG, of course, gave oral evidence to an all-parliamentary group on kinship carers and lack of legal aid a few weeks ago. The deadline for submission of written evidence on that is today, the 4th of April. Members can read our response on the resource pages of our website. And on that note, that's it for another edition of the podcast. You can read more on that, the items discussed today, and many more besides by going to bulletin number 13, available on the LLG website now. So it's goodbye from me.
And from me too.
Thank you for listening. Have a good week.